with us saying, all praise is due to God Almighty, subhanahu wa ta'ala, peace and blessings upon all his prophets and his final messenger, Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Honored and privileged to have here today this year's RHUL Holloway Chaplaincy Lecture for Williams. I don't want to go too much into Williams' life and the usual standard is for us to give a biography and a discussion of who he is. I'll briefly just mention what we've got here for. Williams is a Christian revert to Islam who blogs on different topics such as Islamic theology, philosophy and governance. He's a bibliophile based in London and the south of France. And you're here to hear from him a little bit about his life, and also topics around secular liberalism, just things that are affecting all of us, I guess, in this society of modernity, post-modernity, as we're living here in the West. It's also a little bit about his journey through Christianity into Islam, and it's just a real privilege to have Paul here with us. So I hope you can lend him a kind ear. And I've always wanted to say, as I drove up here, Paul, you're most welcome, sir.
As an India, I'll explain.
Will you mic is on?
Is my mic on? Can you hear me in the back? Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Yes. You can. People are thinking their time. Well, is it going to be a recitation first? Shall we try?
Yes.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أخت هارون ما كان أبوك امرأ سوء وما كانت أمك بغيا. فأشارت إليه. قالوا كيف تكلم من كان في المهد صبيا. قال إني عبد الله آتاني الكتاب وجعلني مباركا أينما كنت وأوصاني بالصلاة والزكاة ما دمت حيا وبرا بوالدتي ولم يجعلني جبارا شقيا. وسلام علي يوم ولدت ويوم أموت ويوم أبعث حيا. ذلك عيسى بن مريم قول الحق الذي فيه يمترون. ما كان لله أن يتخذ من ولد سبحانه إذا قضى أمرا فإنما يقول له كن فيكون. وإن الله ربي وربكم فاعبدوه. هذا صراط مستقيم.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. That's, by the way, the Muslim greeting, meaning peace be upon you. I just want to say very quickly, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar, I'm an academic, so I'm just giving you my own personal feelings about my very insignificant journey, and some of the things that I've discovered on the way. Make of them what you will, inshallah. I just want to begin with a personal story in a way. Some years ago now, I think it was in my early 20s, you can guess how long ago that was, I was living in London, and I wasn't a Christian, wasn't a Muslim, and I was cycling back from a South London all-night party. We won't go there. But anyway, and I was in North London going up Islington High Street, and it was a beautiful sunny morning, absolutely summer, I don't really remember, and I saw this rather beautiful church. I love architecture, amazing architecture here, by the way. First I've ever seen it, just blown away by it. And I saw St Mary's Church, classical architecture. Well, I'll go in, the doors were open, it was a Sunday morning, and I can't actually remember if there was a service going on, to be honest, or what was happening, but I went in, and just out of sheer curiosity, to be honest. And something remarkable to me happened. I felt very unexpectedly, external to myself, a very powerful force, which kind of felt like love. It wasn't terror, it wasn't anything else, just pressing on me. And this was really unexpected. And I knew if I hung around in that church for very long, I would break down. It was such an impactful, strong presence that was bearing down on me. And it certainly wasn't from within me, it was very much external. So I felt, right, I've got to leave now. It's too much. I'm going to break down into tears or something if I stay around. And I thought, what on earth just happened? And I remember thinking about this and returning a week later to the same church, hoping for a repeat performance, because I was curious. Of course, nothing happened. But this unexpected and apparently bizarre experience is the beginning of my spiritual journey as an adult in my early 20s. And because I'd been brought up in a very nominal Christian background, I wasn't Christian as a child, my parents were very nominal, weren't practicing anything, the pattern was there in a way in my life, and I thought, well, okay, let's look into Christianity. So I got hold of a Bible. I think I borrowed it from the library, I don't remember owning one at that stage, and began reading it, because it seemed, well, this is a holy book, and I've had a religious experience, so this is what I must do. So I started reading it, and me being me, I took a great interest and read it carefully and tried to learn from it and so on. And cutting a long and very boring story short, within about a year or year and a half, I found myself in a Baptist church near where I still live, in Paddington, called Westbourne Park Baptist Church, where the fellowship exhibited a lot of love and fellowship, and they're very inclusive and welcoming, and they're very evangelical, of course. So they preached that Jesus was God in the incarnation of the Trinity, and Jesus died for my sins and so on. But so I bought the whole thing, and I thought, great, the experience was speaking to me of a God of love. And so I embraced evangelical Christianity. And I can even remember the exact date that I became a born-again Christian, as you do. And that was okay. So I had some amazing, more spiritual experiences, which I won't go into. Why I mention all this is because that's the beginning of my spiritual journey, which leads up to where I am today as a Muslim, alhamdulillah. And I'm just going to mention a few reasons why I am a Muslim today. I haven't left Jesus. I still very much admire and love Jesus as a prophet, as a Messiah, of course. But maybe it's because of the kind of person I am, I started to study the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, in the New Testament, with great interest and care. And a complete openness to what they were about. I mean, I had no idea, to be honest. And so I started with Matthew and then Mark and so on. And a lot of it's actually amazing, this extraordinary man, Jesus. But there were one or two things that started to trouble me. And because I was an evangelical, charismatic Christian, I thought, well, the devil was trying to cause doubt in my mind. That's what the devil does. So I was beginning to doubt my doubts. But nevertheless, the doubts persisted. And one of them, I mean, there were several big issues. I'm not going to go into them now because some of them became quite academic to do with eschatology and things. But the one I want to mention now is a passage in Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, where the following story is recounted. And when I first read this, I thought, That can't be right. It can't be said in what it's saying. And this set me off to biblical commentaries, to scholars, to pastors, anyone who could help me explain this passage. And the passage goes like this. I almost know it verbatim. There's Mark chapter 10, verse 17 onwards. And it begins, the short story goes like this. A man came to Jesus and said to him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? There is no one who is good but God alone. Then obey the commandments." And Jesus lists 5 of the commandments, taken from the 10 commandments. Don't steal, honor your father and mother, and so on. The man said to Jesus, "I've obeyed all those since I was a youth." Jesus looked at him and loved him and said, "You lack one thing. Go sell all you have and give your money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." Now that's a lot in that passage. But the thing I want to focus on at this point is the statement of Jesus responding to being called good. "Good teacher," says the man. Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." Okay, well, I thought you were God, because I believed he was divine. So that was a bit odd. So it sent me off to biblical commentaries, and I must have read many academic commentaries over the years. And many do say, and most of these are like Christians, that Jesus is apparently denying he is good, denying he is divine, denying he's good. Now, why would, even from a Muslim point of view, why would someone deny they're good? Well, if he was a humble Jewish rabbi, prophet, and a man, he wants to make a point, a man sort of casually said, "Oh, you're good," he might say, "Well, no, I'm a humble Jewish devout believer in God. And this is an attribute of God. He is truly good. He is truly holy. He is truly just," and so on. So, and that was how I began to interpret the passage. But of course, it clashed with my theology, which believed that Jesus was God, Trinity, the Trinity, the Incarnation, and so on. So that led me to discover the Gospels in a way that didn't always conform to standard evangelical teaching. And there are other passages in the Gospels that, to me, clash with the later Christian narrative of who Jesus was and other matters as well. Now, I just want to share with you this, because this is the beginning of what I discovered. In going to scholarship, I discovered some interesting facts. And what I'm going to tell you now, by the way, are not my theories, not some wacky marginal Muslim take. I'm going to give you the standard academic mainstream consensus that you'll hear at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, possibly here, I don't know, but wherever New Testament studies is taught. Now, I'm not saying this is infallible, you can disagree with it, but this is the major mainstream model. And it's this, I'll briefly run through it, because it matters. You'll see why in a minute, why it matters, hopefully. Okay, what we now know, and what scholars now tell us, so I don't know, this is what scholars tell us, is that the earliest gospel to be written is the Gospel of Mark. Now, this is not the first in the New Testament, that's Matthew. But anyway, the shortest one is the earliest one by Mark. And later on, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke both used Mark in the writing of their own Gospels. So they basically gobble up Mark, sometimes word for word, whole passages are identical. Sometimes they change the wording in subtle ways, or sometimes in very significant ways. And if you look at the Greek, because the New Testament's in Greek, by the way, Jesus spoke Aramaic, of course, he didn't speak Greek, probably. He spoke a language which was very similar to Aramaic, a cognate language, Aramaic, Arabic, Hebrew. He spoke this, the Gospels in their language, very, very different. As different as English is to Chinese, I would argue. Anyway, so what scholars have discovered is that Matthew and Luke used Mark. They change him. But when they change him and how they change him is really interesting. Because it seems like the later Gospels disagree with Mark. Sometimes they change him because they don't like what he said. And the passage I just quoted from Mark 10, is one of those passages that is changed by later Gospel writers. And how they change it is very interesting. So, this is called the two-source hypothesis. This is the academic bit of the evening, by the way. So, Matthew, this shows that Mark contributes to Matthew and Luke, as I've said, and also this mysterious thing called Q. Now, this is not a Star Trek character called Q. This is mean Quell in German, means source. So Matthew and Luke are used by Mark and Q are both used later by Matthew and Luke, and they have their own unique material as well. So that's called the two-source hypothesis. What this means, by the way, is the Gospels are almost certainly not eyewitness testimony. They're not written by Matthew, for example, or Mark, the companion of Peter, or John, the disciple Jesus loved, or we're going to talk about John separately in a minute. It's a different kind of gospel. They're second generation, remember this is mainstream scholarship, they're second generation anonymous biographies, inverted commas, written by Christians, Greek-speaking Christians who are highly literate, not by the disciples of Jesus. That's the overwhelming agreement now of historians today. Take it, agree with it or not, it's up to you. So Matthew, we don't know who wrote Matthew. So we don't know. It's a very Jewish gospel. But he changes Mark, he adds to it, he corrects it. He deletes passages he doesn't agree with. So how does Matthew treat Mark, chapter 10, verse 17? Remember, in Mark, it says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone. If you look at Matthew's version, read it from this is the NRSV, the academic gold standard of Bible translations. I'll read you what Matthew's version of this same passage says. Then someone came to him and said, Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And he said to him, why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments. Then he lists the same commandments that Mark does, and the same point about selling all your possessions, having treasure in heaven. So if you're a very attentive reader of the Gospels, you'll notice that Matthew has changed the words of Mark. Now, I was very privileged. Part of what I do is on Broader Theology, my website, this is a commercial, right? Is interview some leading scholars and academics in the West. And one of them happened to be a guy called John Barton, professor of Scripture at Oxford. He's one of the world's leading biblical scholars. He's also an Anglican priest. And we discussed this, or he discussed this, and he said, and you can watch it on my channel, he said that Matthew was being dishonest. So this is a Christian scholar, so it's about his own scriptures, and he's at the highest level. Because Matthew changes Jesus' words from a denial that he, Jesus, is good, to a completely different point. Why do you ask me about what is good? What do you mean, why do you ask me? Well, you're the Messiah. But, so there is that change that's happened. And Matthew changes the words of Mark in other ways to diminish the negative portrait of the disciples, in some cases, and also to heighten the Christology of Jesus, heighten his status. He becomes more of a divine kind of being in Matthew than he is in Mark, where he's very much a human being who doesn't know things, doesn't know the date of the end. He asks who touched me when he's being pressed around the crowd. He denies that he is God or good in Mark chapter 10. And these are subtly changed or dramatically changed in Matthew. So that's why Barton said his word dishonest. He's not faithfully and reliably reporting the words of Mark. He's changing the words of Jesus. And many scholars now will say that Mark 10, verse 17, is some of the most reliable, historically reliable material we have in the Gospels. And Dale Martin, for example, who's a Trinitarian Christian, professor at Yale of the New Testament, he told me that this passage we're discussing, in his view, is the most reliable passage in the Gospels. Why? Because it goes against the beliefs and teaching of the later church. So when these Gospels were written, so Mark is typically dated around 70 AD, Matthew about 85, 90, ditto for Luke. That wasn't the belief. They believed Jesus was in some sense divine. So to have that passage which contradicted that belief suggested maybe it was quite antique, very, very early. So that's something I discovered, by the way, as an evangelical Christian as well. So you can see how that messed with my head. On the one hand, I believed Jesus was Lord in the Trinity, and I went to church every week, and I prayed, believed the Bible and all that. On the other hand, I was discovering all this stuff, and I became quite split. It's actually quite psychologically difficult to handle, quite distressing actually, I will be honest with you, because I was carrying these incompatible paradigms in my mind for a long time, and the only thing that released me from this conflict ultimately was Islam, but that's coming shortly. So that's enough about that. I just want to very briefly touch on the Gospel of John, which I've not mentioned deliberately, and scholars generally bracket out John from these Gospels, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a Greek term, Greek words meaning syn, meaning together, S-Y-N, or with, and optics, meaning to see. So synoptic, meaning to see together. So you can see these three Gospels together, they're very similar. And that's the jargon in biblical scholarship. John is different. And John is often seen as much less historically reliable than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'll just say very quickly about Luke. John. In John, we had Jesus saying things like, I am the light of the world, or before Abraham was, I am, or I am the resurrection and the life. And on and on, these amazing sayings, which I only ever found in one place in the entire Bible, in John. And he talks differently about, other than that, his whole discourse is more about his relationship with the Father, the Son and the Father, and he's incarnate, says at the beginning of John, and the Word, the Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. Incarnation suddenly appears. There's no incarnation taught by Mark. You won't find any idea that Jesus as God become flesh in Mark. But you kind of see the beginnings of that in John. And there are many other unique features to the Gospel, which I won't go into. So how do we account for these two big differences? The way Jesus is portrayed in John, the very high Christology, he's a divine figure, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. That's the divine name, it would seem. So many people say that. Christians will tell you this. And indeed, it might well be. But that's not found in any other gospel. So Jesus went around talking like this. And Luke boasts at the beginning, I've surveyed everything carefully from the beginning, dear Theophilus, to give an orderly account to you of what happened with Jesus. He knows nothing of these sayings. Neither does Mark, neither does Matthew. So how do we account for this difference? Well, I'll tell you what scholars say. And then we have just two sentences from this marvelous book called The Historical Figure of Jesus by E.P. Saunders, who just died recently, actually. He was one of the most distinguished scholars of the New Testament in America. And this is a classic work. I do recommend it very much if you want a good introduction to the historical Jesus. But the author himself is a Christian, a liberal Protestant one, but still a Christian. And he says this about the differences between John and the Synoptics. Consequently, for the last 150 years or so, scholars have had to choose. They have almost unanimously, and I think entirely correctly, concluded that the teaching of the historical Jesus is to be sought in the Synoptic Gospels, and that John represents an advanced theological development in which meditations on the person and work of Christ are presented in the first person, as if Jesus said them. That's page 71. Wow. And I read that as an evangelical Christian as well. And I thought, what? So this is like 99% of biblical scholars, most of whom are Christians, they're one or two exceptions, like Bart Ehrman, who started off as a Christian and is now an atheist, think that the Gospel of John is largely an advanced theological development. Or in our language, it's fiction. Now, that's an offensive term to use, but I want to call a spade here, because it's clear that the historical Jesus, according to the experts, overwhelmingly did not say these words. So if Jesus is made to say these words, if these words are put on his lips, I call that fiction. Now, there are other polite words which you can use, like it's secondary or it's whatever, but that's something else. So here am I, and I went to see Billy Graham once, the great evangelist in, where was it, in Earl's Court. He said, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I am the good shepherd, and I am this, and I am that. I'm thinking, but all your scholars don't really think Jesus said this. Ouch. so that was another weight or burden I had to carry around with me. As a believing Christian, by the way, I hadn't abandoned ship at that point. Anyway, so what must I do to be saved? Is a question that many people ask these days. And we've already had one answer from Mark's Gospel. You know, a man ran up to Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? Why do you call me good? Know the commandments." Remember in Matthew's Gospel? If you wish to enter into life, obey the commandments. Is the microphone on? Can you hear the back?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not really. Sorry.
I can't hear. It's not.
I can hear it. It's echoes.
It echoes?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
And you talk slowly, so.
I'm trying. Sorry, I'm rushing.
Sorry.
So already in Matthew's Gospel, we've heard Jesus say, if you want to enter into life, obey the commandments. These commandments are, of course, the Jewish commandments, the 613 commandments given to Moses on Mount Sinai. We read all about them in Exodus, or Deuteronomy, and so on. But that's a strange, unchristian answer, really. You won't normally hear evangelists say that. What you would normally hear them say is another passage. And I'm quoting here from the book of Acts, where the jailer in Philippi says to Paul, the Apostle Paul, "What must I do to be saved?" And Paul said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." That's Acts 16. So later on, after Jesus ascended into heaven, some early Christians, not all of them, were saying, if you want to be saved, believe in Jesus. That's different from what Jesus said, according to the Gospels, during his ministry. And I would characterize this very simplistically as saying, we've gone from the religion of Jesus to the religion about Jesus. So Jesus is now the center of the message. Whereas before, for Jesus, God was the center of the message. And I think that's the fundamental paradigm shift we see in much early, not all, but much early Christianity. And I just want to quote to you a few words from this book, which another one I really highly recommend, called The Brother of Jesus and the Lost Teachings of Christianity. Now this sounds sensationalist, a bit tabloidy, but don't be deceived. It's a work of serious scholarship by Jeffrey J. Butts, who's a Lutheran minister and professor of world religions at Penn State University in America. And he says this, and it's all about James, by the way. Jesus had a brother, did you know that? An actual, real brother, who headed up the church in Jerusalem after Jesus left the scene. And he was like the first pope, if you like, not Peter, of the early Jewish Christian movement. And what he believed is very similar, we discovered, to what Islam teaches, in contrast to what Paul, I've not really discussed him yet, but he's the author of many letters in the New Testament, what he said. He made a religion about Jesus. So the author of this book says, I think it's very helpful because he mentions Islam as well. And remember, the author of this book is a Christian, so he believed Jesus died and rose again, but he was very interesting, very well informed. As abundant evidence has shown us, after Jesus' crucifixion, his family and disciples continued to worship together in the temple in Jerusalem, manifesting no difference from their fellow Jews, except in their belief that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. Unfortunately, for these harmonious beginnings, Pauline Christianity, this is the Christianity of Paul, increasingly adopted an understanding of Jesus that Judaism could not ultimately bear. The Hellenistic theological belief that Jesus was literally God incarnate in human flesh. As the doctrine of the incarnation became ever more central to Gentile Catholic Christianity, an impassable theological wall arose between Jews and Christians. The doctrine of the incarnation is also the great wall that separates Muslims and Christians. Most Christians today are completely unaware that Muslims highly revere Jesus and honour his teachings. They even believe in the virgin birth. And we heard the brother recite from Surah Miriam, named after Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the Quran itself. But like their Jewish cousins, Muslims believed in strict monotheism and could never accept the key Christian dogma of the Incarnation and the Trinity. It's therefore potentially significant, he says, for interreligious dialogue today that one of the firm conclusions of modern research into James, who's the brother of Jesus, has revealed that neither Jesus' family nor the apostles nor his Jewish disciples believed that Jesus was literally God. Okay, and that is actually the case. There's no evidence that any of the actual followers of Jesus thought he was God. They believed, though, that Jesus was the Messiah, adopted, quotes of the original, by God as his son at his baptism by John, but still a human being. That the earliest Christian doctrine was in no way incompatible with Jewish doctrine is evidenced above all by the fact that the Jews in Jerusalem continued to accept Jesus' followers as fellow Jews. They saw him as being particularly rigorous and pious Jews. They saw them as really devout Jews, in other words. And he continues, it is more than intriguing that the Muslim understanding of Jesus is very much in conformity with the first Christian orthodoxy, the original Jewish Christian understanding of Jesus. So that's a bit of a mind blower. And just to conclude, my talk's in two sections. This is the first part, just to conclude with a quote from this guy, who I'm sure some of our Christian friends, our Catholic Christian friends will know. Hans Kuhn was a Catholic priest. He actually died quite recently. And he said this in his book on Islam. He was a Swiss academic who ended up in Germany and a very prominent Roman Catholic theologian. And he said this, lines lead from the very first Jewish Christianity to the 7th century, indeed to Islam. The analogies between a Quranic picture of Jesus and a Christology with a Jewish Christian stamp are perplexing. Notice you find it a little bit confusing. These parallels are irrefutable and call for more intensive historical and systematic reflection. So even at the highest levels of the Catholic Church, people get it. If you look at the earliest Christianity, which is really Judaism, and you compare that with the teaching of Islam, you will see remarkable similarities, as he says there. But for him, it's perplexing. It's not something he's comfortable with, for obvious reasons, because he is a Catholic priest, and you can see he's considered by many a leading intellectual giant of the Roman Catholic Church. On the more liberal side, he certainly wasn't a fan of Ratzinger or Benedict XVI. But that's another story. We won't go there. So the last thing I wanted to say about this subject, I'm not going to dwell on this more because this is a bit, I just find this very interesting. And I discovered this much later as a Muslim, by the way. The 112th surah of the Quran, which I know by heart and I often pray it during my salah, speaks of the oneness of God. And actually in English, I'm not going to recite it in Arabic because that would be hugely humiliating for me. Say, he is God, the one unique. God is the absolute self-sufficient. He did not beget, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him. That's the Quran. Well, that's the English interpretation of the meanings of the Quran. And it's been noticed, not just by this chap, that this is a piece of what a friend of mine at Oxford called precision theology. So the Quran is demonstrating a fantastically precise bit of theological analysis here. So on the right you have Surah Ikhlas, he is God the unique. And what it's doing is, if you look at the Arabic and the Hebrew, it's echoing and affirming the Shema. Shema is the Jewish creed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. This is Talmud. So indeed the word in Hebrew, Echad, is the same pretty much as Achad in Arabic. So the Quran is affirming the Jewish Shema, the Jewish creed, if you like. And on the left here we have the Nicene Creed, which also states they believe in one God. So there's agreement on the first line. The next line, God is absolute self-sufficient, and that is seen by many scholars as affirming that God is one and not in any way a trinity, The next line, he did not beget, nor is he begotten. And this is a critique of the Nicene Creed, which speaks of the Son being begotten of the Father, as the same substance. And at the bottom you write, and there is none like unto him. So God is unlike anything that we can conceive of. And that is a critique of the idea of the Son, Jesus, being of one substance with the Father. So the academic paper is written about the way Nicholas is critiquing the Nicene Creed, which is the creed that Christians often recite at Mass or in Sunday services, in a very precise, careful, nuanced way. And me, not coming from a theological background, I really appreciate the precision and care in the Quran when it critiques these beliefs. Anyway, moving on. So, part 2, which is a different world. I'm going to just talk here some of my own views about secular liberalism and modernity and what Islam can say to us. Why start with the French Revolution? Well, it's pretty random, but it's a defining moment in the Western tradition in the West. But the Western tradition, by which I mean, goes back to Alexander the Great, Hellenism, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, all the way through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and so on. But in terms of secularism, secular liberalism, a key moment in history is the French Revolution in 1789. And this is a poster from that year. It says, amongst other things, it talks about liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, brotherhood, or death. A lot of people died under the guillotine in this liberation movement. Anyway, it pushed back against the church. It really crippled the church, and the monarchy obviously was destroyed. And you have what today in France is called laïcité, this idea of quite militant secularism, actually. It's supposed to be a neutral public space where no religion has privilege or given any advantages, and everyone's treated the same. But that's not quite what happens in practice, as we know from Muslims. Muslim women, for example, it's quite legal in France for any employer to refuse to employ a Muslim simply because of the way they dress. By the way, it's not just the state, teachers, the civil servants who have this prohibition on the hijab. It can apply to every employer in France, which makes Muslim sisters' positions very difficult, of course. I just wanted to share with you some words from a friend of mine, because I live in France as well, and she's a neighbour across the road. She's an English lady, she's a teacher. I won't mention who she is. I got permission to quote her, but I'm not going to reveal who she is. She's a teacher in a French school. Very bright lady. And she's not a Muslim, or a Christian particularly. And she said this to me after I was moaning to her about the perfectly legal French discrimination against Muslims today. And she said this: as far as I have understood it over the years, freedom and tolerance in French society, liberty, freedom, only start when you conform. You worship what you want, wear what you want, speak the language you want privately, so long as outwardly you present the model of a Napoleonic vision of a French citizen. It's bonkers, excuse my language, that's what she said. A sexually dressed woman is considered very French, so they're fine with that. The idea that you need to conform before benefiting from the liberté, etc., is built into their cultural fabric. It's their blind spot. They consider themselves very tolerant. And they do. That they think they're perfectly freedom-loving and tolerant. But actually, they're not. It's a blind spot. They don't get it. Most of them don't get it. The rest of the world does, actually. Most of the rest of the world sees the issue. Now, this is a lovely quote from one of my current interests, and that is a guy called Professor RHUL. He's a professor at Columbia University in the States. He's actually a Palestinian Christian. I say that because his views, he recently ranked in the top 500 Muslim figures in the world, even though he's not a Muslim. Anyway, there's a reason why he is like that. And this is a marvellous quote. I like it anyway. And he he has a profound understanding. He's a political theorist, historian, he's an expert on Islamic law, a brilliant intellectual, and I do recommend you look up his works like The Impossible State. Fantastic work. Anyway, he said this: let us remember what secularism is. Secularism is not just segregating religious life into the private sphere. It is rather the determination of the state of what religion is and is not, where and how it can be exercised, In terms of political theology, secularism is the murder of God by the state, in terms of political theology. The state can delimit, limit, exclude, or curtail any religious practice, and thus has the power to determine the quality and quantity of the religious sphere as it sees fit. So that is very much speaking, I think, to a hard secularist model we see in France and in some other countries in the world. Less so here in the UK, but it's still, I think we're moving in that direction, actually, politically. We're not there yet, but we're much more tolerant in the UK, I've discovered, than we are in France. So I just thought I'd share that fascinating quote with you. And this is a more disturbing picture. It's a 1958 colonial poster from the Algerians were forced to look at to stop wearing the veil. If you read French, it says, "Aren't you pretty? Unveil yourself." So this is the French government in the 1950s telling Muslim women not to wear hijab. That's an actual poster produced by the French government and circulated around Algeria. So you see Halak's words here. Secularism is not neutral. He's actually trying to turn them into French women, unveiled women. Now, just jumping around here a bit, atheism is a big issue today, I think, in the West, particularly, and even beginning to be a problem in the Arab world. And I'm quite active on Twitter in countering that, as you might know, with my No Design posts, ironically entitled. And I think I just want to share this with you because these two figures are very prominent American people who are atheists. They call themselves atheists. And a lot of atheists identify as atheists for these reasons. So Thomas Nagel is a very distinguished professor of philosophy in New York. He's actually written some interesting stuff. And he says, I want atheism to be true. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So here's someone who chooses to be atheist because they really, really don't want to believe anyway. Muslims will call that kufr, obviously. And this other guy, Martin Ronson, he says, if God proved he existed, I still wouldn't believe in him. I don't believe in God, not because I can't, but because I don't want to. And there are a lot of people, I think, who call themselves atheists who have issues. They're emotional, maybe they had an event in their life which was distressing, maybe the relationship broke up, or they didn't get that job, whatever. And they take it out on God. People often say, what's the opposite of love? Is it hate? Well, no. The opposite of love is indifference. And you literally obliterate out from your life this person that you once believed existed. And I think for some atheists, maybe a lot, they have atheism because they want to, it's anger. It's coming from a position of wanting to literally exterminate that source of resentment and anger in their lives. And then they call themselves, and afterwards they find reasons like the problem of pain, but this is post-hoc rationalization. So I thought that's quite interesting. And this is one of my favourite memes of all time. So I do tweet this one a lot. Apologies. It's so good. Okay, a bunch of atheists going door to door, atheist evangelists. This pamphlet is blank. Well, we're atheists. They have nothing to give. They have nothing to say. So that's the moral of that story. What can atheists give you? They give you nothing. Their pamphlet is blank. Before we come to that, very lastly, I'm aware of time, I just want to quote to you from a very controversial writer. He's not my favourite writer, He's called Douglas Murray. Now, Douglas Murray is a very well-known English commentator. He's a very conservative. He's written lots of books, and he is very influential globally. A lot of people read his stuff, and I do too. He's a very good writer. This book is called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam. And he doesn't like Muslims. Right? He calls himself a gay atheist. That's what he calls himself. So he's an atheist. And he's gay, he says. And at the very last, this is actually a really interesting book. In the last chapter, he talks about where we are today in the West. Okay. He talks about the Western tradition and faith and science and reason and all these things he likes. But he talks about the existential crisis and emptiness at the heart of Europe, in the West. And I think he is spot on. And after I read this, I'm going to come to some words by a man called Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, better known as Tim Winter, an English guy who did University of Islam from Cambridge University. And I think he has a very powerful response to what this guy, Douglas Murray, says. So he says on page 258, the problem is one that is easier to feel than it is to prove. But it runs something like this. The problem in the West. What's the easiness in the West? What's the problem? That life in modern liberal democracies is, to some extent, thin or shallow. And that life in modern Western Europe, in particular, has lost its sense of purpose. This is not to say that our lives are wholly meaningless, nor that the opportunity liberal democracy uniquely gives to pursue our own conception of happiness is misguided. On a day-to-day basis, most people find deep meaning and love from their families, friends, and much else. But there are questions that remain, which have always been central to each of us, and which liberal democracy on its own cannot answer and was never meant to answer. What am I doing here? What is my life for? Does it have any purpose beyond itself? These are questions that have always driven human beings, questions that we have always asked and are still. Yet for Western Europeans, the answers to these questions that we have held on to for centuries seem to have run out. Happy as we are to acknowledge that, we are far less happy to acknowledge that with our story of ourselves having run out, we are nevertheless still left with the same questions. And even to ask such questions today has become something like bad manners. I like this because if you go to a typical English dinner party, you don't mention these kind of questions like, what's life about? What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning? You'll talk about the weather or TV, but you don't talk about this or politics. It's just bad manners to even ask these questions now, he says. And he says the spaces where such questions can be asked, let alone answered, have accordingly shrunk, not only in number, but in their ambition for answers. If people no longer seek for answers in churches, and they tend not to these days, we simply hope that they might find sufficient meaning in the occasional visit to an art gallery or at a book club. Okay, book club? Okay. I suppose it depends on what books you read. So that's Douglas Murray's despairing ending to his book, and I think it's accurate. And even though he's a great champion of Western tradition, civilization, values, over against the other, you want to know who the other is, what has he got to offer to us? All of us as Europeans. It's a big fat zero, and he admits it. And that's a great shame. I don't want Western civilization to offer nothing, but he admits that it does, and I think he's right. So that's the situation I think we do find ourselves in. I want to come to some words towards the end now, as I said, by a guy called Abdul Hakim Murad. His recent book, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam and Europe. I do highly recommend this book. Tim Winter is a professor of Islamic Studies at Cambridge University, one of the West's top Islamic scholars, and a brilliant man. Anyway, at the very beginning, he says this, that Muslims find themselves, we find ourselves, at home everywhere. For this same universalism of Islam enables a local rooting which recognizes that, he quotes the Quran, wheresoever you may turn, there is the face of God. Wherever you turn, there is God's face. That's Quran 3:115. Now, he continues, such is this Muslim sense of belonging that believers feel more at home in a place than any atheist could, since to lose contact with God is immediately to forfeit one's sense of connection to a place of his making. It is to feel one's roots and identity shrivel. There can be no truly English, German, or Russian atheist. From this kind of Muslim perspective, Lenin was not Russian. Douglas Murray is not British. And Sam Harris is not American. These are three big atheists. They seem to wait in a forlorn foreign encampment, even when officially at home. By contrast, to become Muslim, or to arrive from an Islamically Abrahamic place, and to maintain that traditional sensibility which perceives God's signs superabundantly everywhere, is immediately to see the land with understanding, and hence to begin to grow roots and to adorn and engage the earth. Such, very roughly, is the Islamic theory of Abrahamic mobility. Unlike Israel's wanderings in exile, which await the Messianic intervention, which would take the people to a home greater than all homes, Muslims travel from one home to an equal other, and do not cherish a return to the mother of cities, except as visitors. They migrate Abrahamically, but every country, for them, is a promised land. So we're at home here in England, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in the United States, because this is God's land. And as Muslims, if we're good Muslims, we worship the true God, the God of Abraham. How can this be alien to us? This is God's land, and we are his people. And people like Douglas Murray, who are very proud to be British, are against the other, says Tim Winter, are not truly English, because they're not naturally inhabiting this land in that sense. They're alienated from it because they're atheists. And that's quite a provocative thing for him to say, but I think is profound and true. And very lastly, I would be glad to hear. I'm not going to go into the whole feminism, LGBT issues because I don't want to be cancelled, and I don't want to bore you, and who cares what I think anyway. So it's a bit chopped off. I'll read it out from my notes. But I did want to quote this word from Tim Winter, it's the same guy, about secular feminism. So I might still get cancelled, actually. We shall see. Yeah, sorry it's cut off like that, but I'll get it on my iPhone so I can read it. So this is really important about how Islam, I think, is so helpful in a way to provide solutions and answers, because it conforms to our human nature, our fitra. It comes out of what it is to be human. It's not an alien ideology imposed on us, an impossible creed to believe. It's something that emerges and is in harmony with our natures. And with that in mind, we're going to hit some words here about feminism. Islam's awareness that when human nature, fitra, is cultivated rather than suppressed, men and women will incline to different spheres of activity, is of course one which provokes howls of protest from liberals. For them, it is a classic case of blasphemy. But even in the primitive biological and utilitarian terms, which are the liberals' reference, the case for absolute identity of vocation is highly problematic. In other words, the idea that men and women can do all the same jobs equally, absolutely without any differences whatsoever, is, Tim Winter says, problematic. However heavily society may brainwash women into seeking absolute parity, in other words, complete equality and sameness, it cannot ignore the reality that they have babies and have a tendency to enjoy looking after them. Those courageous enough to leave their careers while their children are small increasingly have to put up with accusations of blasphemy and heresy from society. But they persist in their belief, outrageous to the secular mind, that mothers bringing up children is better than having childminders, that breast milk is better than formula milk, and that even, and this is the ultimate blasphemy, that bringing up a child can be more satisfying than trading bonds or driving buses. Even I can see that, I'm a man. I like the language, because the language of, this is very controversial, but wokeism, as some people call it, has some characteristics of a religion these days. So it has a creed, it has people who are blasphemers, who disagree with it, and heretics, and you can be treated as someone who needs to be punished if you are a blasphemer. So he's using this kind of religious trope to describe the characteristics of militant feminism, militant LGBT wokeism. And his alternative, of course, is Islam, which cultivates, a lovely word. In other words, it brings out, it nourishes the natural nature. The Quran says that we're made as male and female. It's dimorphic condition we're in. And that sits beautifully with human nature. But the alternative is to suppress that and to force us all into identical modes of behaviour and being, and this is something that doesn't work. And I think he's right. So Islam offers a different way of living, one which is more in accord with our human natures. And that brings happiness, it brings fulfillment, it brings people who are deeply satisfied with their existence, rather than, the alternatives which we all know too well. And very lastly, this is someone who had the privilege of interviewing on my channel, Blogging Theology. This man, Joram van Cleverand, he was a leading Dutch member of Parliament, a member of the Freedom Party. The Freedom Party is almost came to power in Holland, and lots of MPs. They're viciously anti-Muslim, hate Muslims. Geert Wilders, the leader, wants to ban the Quran from Holland, and a whole bunch of other things you wouldn't believe. And this guy was his number two. And you can still see him from those days. And he started to write a book on Islam to refute it, to show how terrible Islam is. And he started to research it. And he had one quality of this man which saved him, and that is sincerity, integrity. And he discovered, while writing this book, damning Islam, that actually what he believed about Islam was all wrong. And he ended up converting to Islam. He's now a Muslim. He's a Sunni Muslim. In fact, all he did was he got in touch with Tim Winter, who I mentioned, and they had a long conversation. In fact, Tim Winter mentioned, very interesting, he invented this idea, or this word, submarines. I've not heard this before. So the idea that there are people in the public realm, politicians, statesmen, who are secretly Muslim. And he knows some of these people. And why are they secretly Muslim? Because they, for various reasons in their personal circumstances, they feel at the moment they can't make it public. And that there's a very senior member in the Italian Parliament, who's a far-right MP, who is becoming, I don't know the details, but there are a number of people like this, and Tim is in contact with them. Anyway, Tim was in contact with this far-right Dutch MP, who ultimately became a Muslim, and he wrote a book called Apostate, which I recommend. Anyway, so you can follow him on Twitter. He's a good guy. Someone asked me yesterday, or today, what is it in Islam that attracts so many? I would say it is universal, timeless, very clear, as a beautiful way of worship, and above all, it is the truth. Muslims believe in truth, not postmodernists, not relativists. So that's pretty amazing. I guess with that, I'll end it there.
Very much, Paul. It was a beautiful presentation. Beautiful thoughts with time. The book reference is very, very helpful for myself, particularly about the historic Jesus.
Yeah.
We'll start with the floor for any questions now. You're going to have to shout out because some people at the front can't hear. Are there any questions? Or, is it the roaming mic?
Or disagreements. Believe me, I'm not shy about taking criticism.
Mic to the ground up. You just want to take this one.
No, so I was just going to ask a question when you were, it's more to do with the latter part, when you were sort of quoting Douglas Murray, and the conclusion of quoting essentially Douglas Murray, his thoughts, or the essence of his thoughts, essentially give us nothing.
Yes.
Perhaps as a response, or even if there was someone who was an avid defender of secular liberalism, perhaps which if you could define that would also be quite helpful. I know it's a bit of a term, but they'll say, well, look, if you look at the world around us, let's just take England as an example, we're probably living in the safest time that we've ever had, where people are enjoying the most rights that we have, where technology is advanced so much where we can cure certain diseases, cancer, etc., etc. Surely there's something intrinsic within the values that we're holding, because states are fundamentally founded upon certain ideas and values. There is a superiority to the secular idea, or Muslim specifically. How would you sort of respond to that?
Well, some of that's true. I think we do have remarkable technology. I'm not sure about curing all diseases. I mean, and you know, people's use of antidepressants is increasing, and mental health issues and suicide rates. But apart from all that, there is something to that. But I think Douglas Murray is speaking to our culture. There was a time when we in the West had meaning and purpose. It wasn't that long ago, maybe even as late as the 19th century, where people had a vision of life which transcended just the material, just the getting wealth, the promotion, the increasing your income. There was more to life than materialism. And that was a much better and enriching vision of life. And now we've lost that, he says, and I agree with him, and now we are very materialist. And I don't think it's making us happy. And that's why I would question the premise of that. Are we happier now? I don't think we are. I think it's the opposite. I think we're actually becoming more and more happier. And a friend of mine came back to the UK after some years away, and he said, my God, the people now are so angry here in Britain. We're just angry. And the way you know, customer service has gone downhill, and there's a real sense of frustration. You know, we're not even where we were in his memory of his own lifetime. So I think we should remember that we're not in a normal place. Even within our own parameters of what we understand in our own history, we have lost so much. I'm not sure technology, as you call it, or medical advance, is going to, you know, that deep hole in our lives is making us miserable. And also, you know, that quote about men and women and so on. Many women are becoming increasingly unhappy because they're being, you know, in a sense, encouraged to do things which, like, have careers, and well, they've got to get married, and they've got to have children, and they've got to have a home and be a good wife, and balance all this out. And it's just not, it's just causing endless distress and unhappiness. So I think we're in a crisis in our society. I'm not saying Islam is the only answer, in that there are other expressions of Christianity and Judaism which also can address this, of course. But Islam for me is the purest example of that anywhere. But I'm not saying it's the only one that answers in that sort of binary sense. I don't think that's simplistic. So yeah, my assessment is more pessimistic than that. Just look at the news. And, you know, people are increasingly unhappy with what our society is about. They realise that goods don't make them happy. What they do is just for a very short time. Islam offers deep, satisfying answers forever. You know, a relationship with God, who is Ar-Rahman who's loving and wants the best for us. It offers us a life after death, this very short, transient life. It offers us paradise. It offers us infinitely more than this world can offer. And I think that's the reason I'm listening.
I can predict one of it. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair for the event. I was going to mention, you didn't speak much about your own story, so for someone who might be in your position right now, who might be going from the Christian faith, or maybe in a confused mind state, what would you suggest for them to start on, and what really triggered you to look towards Islam? What books did you read, or maybe what was the moment like when you entered the church?
Yeah.
What flipped the switch of Islam in your mind?
Yeah, I didn't speak much about myself, partly because it's extremely boring and I don't want to send you to sleep, but also because it's not really about me, but it's, I think, I mentioned books, a book that, one of the first books I ever read, if not the first book I ever read, on Islam, I got it from Waterstones in Piccadilly, so it's still there. It's called Islam and the Destiny of Man by Guy Eaton, who's an English convert to Islam. When he died, maybe 10 years ago now, he had been a Muslim for 50 years. He was a diplomat, and he wrote like an angel. I mean, this is an extraordinary book. And this, because he was bilingual, by which I mean he could speak Western ideas, concepts, language. He understood what it needed to be Western, because he was, but also he was also completely Muslim. He'd been a Muslim for long enough. He ended up working in Regent's Park Mosque, where I said my Shahada, actually. Although I never met him, although someone here did. So I recommend this as a way into understanding Islam if you're a Westerner. And it's a beautifully written book. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says now, because I'm not very into that. He has certain pleniless views which I don't agree with. And that's why some people don't recommend him. But I think one can take a great deal of good stuff from him and perhaps leave the rest, if you like. But my own journey was very boring. In 3 seconds, it was I just read and reflected. I went to Regent's Park Mosque as a Christian to find out more about Islam, and argued with them, and they were very patient with me. Very good of them. And I discovered something I never knew existed. Two things. One is Islam, rather than what the BBC or Fox News told me was Islam. And secondly, I do want to say, I'm totally amazed by this, is about this man called Muhammad, upon whom he is. Wow! I mean, I was never taught about him in school. What an extraordinary human being. I mean, what an amazing man. On every level. You know, he exceeded and excelled in so many areas. I mean, you get some people like Alexander the Great. Okay, it's a great general. Maybe Napoleon was a great general. Or Gandhi was a great leader. Or whatever. But this man, Muhammad, upon whom he is, surpassed in his excellence in multiple areas of life. So he was a great commander, he was a great father, he was a great spiritual leader, he was a great friend, he was a great prophet, and so on, and teacher, and so on, and so on. To discover this human being was a massive revelation. And then I had to ask myself as a Christian, if God sent Moses to Israel, I didn't believe he did, he sent the prophets, and he sent Jesus, peace be upon them all. By what logic could I possibly say that God didn't send Muhammad? It just, if I accepted them, why couldn't I accept him? Because they're teaching the same thing. Now, I mentioned Surah 112, Surah Ikhlas. Ahad, the Shema is the same as the Islamic creed. So what Moses taught, which is the Shema, is what Muhammad taught. So, apart from sheer prejudice, as an English, white, Western, or whatever, what was the reason why I couldn't accept him as a prophet? Because there was no reason. So ultimately, my hesitancy in embracing Islam was cultural, because I was aware that I was going to transition from a middle-class, white English position to most of my friends in my faith would be from a different background. And that was the issue at the end of the day. I've got to cross this line, which is a cultural line, a civilizational line. But theologically, I was already there, because I understood Moses, I understood Jesus. Therefore, Muhammad was simply the final messenger of God, sent to all mankind, not just to the Jews. So it was a no-brainer in the end, to put it that way.
So, I mean, the audience in particular about gospel and church and stuff like that, even the higher people like scholars completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
How they react when you say you prove them wrong and shit about what's wrong with the text? In the text and stuff, like, how they react after that, like after you show them, well, this error, and you shouldn't acknowledge.
Oh, well, so when I have people like Professor John Bromwell, I don't do Dower on the channel. It's not a Dower channel. There are plenty of channels that do that. So if I started doing Dower to them, it would no longer be a safe space where academics can come on and share their expertise. So I made that decision early on. So that's part of the DNA of the channel. I mean, John Barton's not an idiot. I mean, he knows about Islam. And that's his decision. And it's not that these Gospels are in error, by the way. I've not said that. It's just that they're not what most Christians tend to think, or lay Christians tend to think, the Gospels are all saying the same thing, they're equally true, and anyway, they're the inspired word of God. It's actually not quite like that. You know, one where later Gospels are correcting and changing an earlier Gospel, and probably doesn't think it's inspired by God. I doubt Matthew thought Mark was inspired, because he's updated him, changed him, he's had a nativity narrative and other things. I think it's an improved edition. I think he wanted to get rid of Mark, or basically said, this is better. Ditto Luke, actually. But Christians treat them all as they're all inspired scripture, which I don't think the original authors saw it like that at all. So no, I don't do Dower directly. I think that would I can't on my channel. It's just, sorry.
Sorry, at what stage do we live in this world where we're dealing with Christian brothers and talking to them? But do we have to become an expert when we ourselves are not? Is to invite them when we have honors to discuss with them and pass on our faith, etc. Until it'll take too long. But yet at the same time, when we are following the principles of system of the Western world, and we are embarrassed with what's happening to Muslim countries as well, oppression, etc. So we sort of tend to take a back seat. But how do we become more involved and be more enthusiastic in discussing it and inviting them, to deal with that situation?
It's difficult because, I don't mean to be rude about Christianity these days, particularly in Western Europe, but it's in decline. There's a recent census that came out, and I spoke to Professor Linda Woodhead, Professor of Sociology and Religion at King's College in London. She's an expert on what's going on in this country about religion. And she noted that adherence to Christian faith, attendance at church, is just precipitously declining. And this is a very long trajectory to go on for decades and decades. The only major faith that is increasing big time is Islam. And Christianity in this country mostly is on its last legs. It's dying. Now, I personally wish that was not so. I want to see anything positive force that can counter secularism, materialism, the nihilism that Douglas Murray speaks about. And Christianity, in many of its ways, is a very positive thing, I think. Not in every respect, but in many respects it is. Traditional Christianity emphasis on family values, for example, is very positive. Now, the Church of England is now abandoning that, obviously, we'll go to that. Do we want to kick a man when he's down, basically? No. We want to offer compassion, we want to offer an alternative, which is not watered down. And Islam is very simple in some ways. In other ways it's very profound, but belief in one God, the belief that God sent Jesus, that he was born of a Virgin Mary, that he was sent to the Jews, that he's taught amazing things. I mean, Muslims can say to Christians, we share the original faith of Jesus and his disciples. And so we have that in common. But as I say, Christianity in the West is really at a very, very low point. To find really strong, robust Christians these days is hard, actually. It's not easy to find them. They're very rare. I mean, talking to the population as a whole. So I think the issues now are to do with secularism, to atheism. People are turning to paganism now. They're turning to witchcraft, the occult. They're turning to black magic. This is something else that Professor Townsend said to me. This is also in the resurgence. So we need to learn how to speak to those involved in witchcraft, Satanists. I kid you not. I mean, people involved in Ouija boards, astrology, angel worship, magic stone. We know all this kind of thing. This is also really, really popular. This kind of pagan ground resurgence of religion, of kind of superstitious pagan religion. That's growing a lot. So we need to now speak to them. And I'm not sure how, actually. I don't have an answer to that. But I think that's where it's going. I think traditional Christians, sadly, are on the radical decline and becoming an endangered species in the West. This is not the case, by the way, in Eastern Europe or other places. It's just here is a problem. America is also suffering from the same problem now. So it's complicated. Our faith is simple. We teach the Tawheed of God, the oneness of God, and that we have values which are eternal, which conform to our human nature, which make us happy and give us success in this life, inshallah, and in the next. I mean, there's a wonderful message and good news, I think. I'm not an expert.
And we give them the book of Quran, just
in English, yeah, English translation, yeah,
absolutely. And it ends up with the same thing as God is, harking for people in universal between nature or the creation, and harking with respect that God has a son. And so it ends up in nowhere again.
But there aren't many Christians around who argue like that anymore. And there aren't many Christians around to stop. I mean, there's a sense that only a minority of British people now self-identify as Christians. A minority. It's the first time ever in the history of England that statistic has come about. I mean, a minority. We're dealing with a small minority now of active Christians who actually go to church. It's not like you go out there and go, no, millions of Christians. What do we say to them? No, there aren't. There's millions of Muslims actually now. So the world has changed now. Here, not so much in Poland or Russia, I grant you, or Hungary, or China, or Sudan, or Brazil. There's not like that there. But here, Christianity is really marginal now. And I think deeper down, we need to realise that that's really our major preoccupation anymore. We need to look at how people, people may be involved in angel worship or just giving their souls over to Virginia.
We'll just take two more questions, two last questions.
Yeah.
Can we get some from sisters, please?
What were the obstacles you faced before converting?
Sorry, can I catch that?
What were the obstacles you faced before converting?
Oh, I see, yeah. Islamophobia, I was very Islamophobic. Well, I mean, towards the end I was. I live in a part of London in Maida which is by the Edgware Road, but it's a very populous vast area. And up the Edgware Road, it became more and more Arab. And I thought that meant Muslim. Of course, it doesn't. A lot of these Lebanese restaurant owners are, of course, Christians. I didn't know that. I was Indian. So I was a bit paranoid, taking over. So it was actually that prompted me in my mind one day, let me just investigate this religion a bit more. Just find out if it really is a religion of terrorism and inhumane values and a threat to the West. And that's why I literally just walked into my local mosque, uninvited. Not that I wouldn't have been welcome, but and as soon as I walked in the doors, I remember it's a big mosque, and on the right was a still the bookshop. Books. So I made a beeline for the bookshop because I could handle that, books there in English. And then, of course, some brother saw that I was just out on a limb. He ended up leaving the mosque with a big pile of books. And that was the beginning of my discovery of Islam, real Islam, actually. But yeah, when I say Islamophobic, I don't think I was outwardly Islamophobic. I didn't persecute anyone or call it, it wasn't like that. It was within my own mind. But I realised it was a position I needed to deal with, and ultimately it led to my embracing Islam.
One last question, you take on this side.
me questions about Islam versus Christianity. So I've been reading the Bible, sorry, and reading the Quran, trying to find answers to these questions. He got involved with the evangelists, and during all the discussions, it goes back to Jesus said, before the word I am, something like this. And the other thing that keeps coming up is Jesus said the way to salvation is through me, and Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Is there any advice that you would give to answer these questions? Because every discussion ends up on these points.
Yeah. I think the Bible is difficult because the Bible is a library of books. It's not like the Quran, actually. And this is the thing with the Bible, Quran, Bible. The Bible is a library of books written by many different people at different times over a 1,000-year period or more. Most of whose authors we have no idea who they are. Even when it says at the top of the page it's by X, we now know that's not necessarily true. A lot of this material has been reworked and re-edited, particularly in the Old Testament, over many, many centuries. This is a commonplace of scholarship. And different Christian groups have different Bibles. It is not. So the Roman Catholic Bible, the canon, the list of scriptures, is different from the Orthodox Church, which is different from the Evangelical Church, which is different, you can go on and on. I don't mean that the New Testament is usually the same, although there's one church that has different New Testament. But the Old Testament books are often different. I won't go into the details now. And a lot of this material in the Bible I think is really good. I mean, I have no problem with it. Like if you read the book of Isaiah, or Jeremiah, or Micah, or Hosea, or many of the stories in the Psalms. Wow, the Psalms of David in the Old Testament are marvelous. Many of them marvelous stuff. So I wouldn't read that stuff like, oh God, I've got to be a Christian. I think, well, this confirms my faith, actually. But there are parts of it, of this library, that didn't fall down. The Quran, of course, is different. It's a single revelation, a single book revealed at a single point in history to a man that we know who this man was, what his name was and where he lived. And that same Quran has never changed. We now know this because we have the manuscript, well, as a Western obsession with manuscripts. We knew that anyway. But from a manuscript point of view, we now have manuscripts that go back to the time of Uthman, one of the caliphs, one of the companions of the Prophet. And I spoke with Dr. Sidki, who's an eminent expert on the Quranic manuscripts on my channel, commercial. And we talked about this about a year ago. We now have all of the Quran in manuscript form from a few years of the Prophet himself, and it's the same Quran. It hasn't changed. Now, you cannot say that about the Bible, unfortunately. For example, the Gospels were written in the 1st century. I mentioned the dates, AD 70 for Mark, for example. But the earliest copies we have of the Gospels, complete copies, are in the 4th century. That's 4 centuries after the birth of Jesus. And these manuscripts, we can see them in the British Library, the Codex Sinaiticus, in the British Library, and the Codex Vaticanus, which by definition is in the Vatican. There you go. And even this had passages missing, which are I'm not going to go there. So fascinating story, but let me go. But you quoted saying in John's Gospel, before Abraham was, I am. And if you heard what I said, or what I was intending to communicate from New Testament scholars, these statements in the 4th Gospel, John, virtually all, in fact, E.P. Sanders says, virtually unanimity amongst experts for the last 150 years, that the Jesus of John's Gospel is a highly interpreted account. It's the least historical of the 4. And these statements, I am the way, the truth, and the life, before Abraham was, I am, which you quoted, I am the light of the world, all these statements are only found in one Gospel, the last to be written, and is considered by working Christian scholars not to be the words of Jesus. He didn't say it, according to Christian scholars. Not me as a Muslim saying this, the experts say this. And this is something I've not mentioned, the big scandal here. And it is a scandal. It's that the Christian ulama, as I call them, the New Testament scholars, they know this stuff. They've been teaching it for a century and a half. It's not a secret. You can buy this stuff in bookshops, like I did. But the ordinary man and woman in the pew does not know anything about this. There's a huge chasm, a gulf, separating the Christian ulama and the man and woman in the pew. Why is this? Because it's a scandal. And the reasons are many. I remember Bart Ehrman, because I've been talking about this actually. Other scholars have noticed this too. But there can be many reasons. Priests, pastors, ministers who train and learn from these professors, so they know what's going on, they fail to pass this on, usually. I mean, there are some exceptions, but usually they don't pass it on. Why don't they pass it on? Well, lots of reasons. One may be they don't want to lose their jobs. I mean, seriously, you've got a wife, kids, you don't want to lose your job. I mean, this is what you do. Or you may not know how to communicate these ideas. I mean, how do you, in a 20-minute sermon, talk about the synoptic problem? You know, or the two-source hypothesis, which I mentioned. How do you talk about that? The pastor may not have the skills to talk about it in terms of his own ability. It could be that he doesn't, in a rather patronising way, he may not want to hurt the faith of the sheep. He may not want to, I don't want to upset them, I don't want to give them this knowledge. Often these people in the pews, by the way, have degrees in chemistry or engineering, or, they're people of education, but on this subject, well, they don't upset their faith. So there are multiple reasons. Whatever the reasons are there in any particular case, it is the case, overwhelmingly, that the very pastors and priests and others who are trained with these experts don't pass on what they know, because they've learnt it at Oxford, Cambridge, London University, Yale, whatever. And that I call a scandal. Let's just call it a scandal. Because it's shocking. Because if the laity knew what was really going on amongst their own intelligentsia, the ulama, they wouldn't come up with questions like this sister presents. Because they would know. But they don't know. So it's left to, Muslims and others like myself and others to actually talk about this publicly. So it's shocking that they don't know. They should know, because it's their own ulama, if you like, talking about it. The fact that they don't is a problem. And they should learn about it and bridge the gap. But unfortunately, bridging the gap will mean a lot of what they believe as lay people will have to change. And who wants to change? I'm comfortable in my beliefs, have to change. It's difficult. It's difficult for me becoming a Muslim in some ways. Anyway.
We'll end it there, and this is from the ISOC. I'll take credit for giving you the chocolate. It was a very lively discussion, and we want to thank Paul for his time, very generous with his time, and his humility, really, just discussing many personal things about his own life and his journey to Islam and the realities that he has to face. You just have to put yourself in that situation. What would it be like to then reconsider all that you believe, all that you've come to know about God, something you hold deeply to, and to take that leap of faith is a big thing, is a noble thing. And the work that he's doing, we're very, very grateful. I watch your channel religiously, and it's a beautiful channel. It is a safe space. I think that academic rigor that you have to allow people to discuss their views, their thoughts, must be there, and it should be compromised. So we appreciate that. Thank you very much. Barakallahu fikum. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.